In the heart of northern Michigan, where winter lingers far longer than it should, there lay a secluded cabin in the woods. It had been passed down through generations in the Weber family, a refuge from the world where they could escape the chaos of urban life. This year, Daniel Weber had decided to spend a month in there, hoping the isolation would give him time to finish his new novel and reclaim some semblance of peace. Little did he know the peace he sought was about to be shattered. Daniel arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow covered landscape. The cabin itself was a modest structure built with dark timber and adorned with a sloping roof, barely peeked out from beneath the snow. The place had always been cozy, with a fireplace that roared with warmth and comfort. As he unpacked his things, Daniel felt a sense of containment, a stark contrast to the tension he had left behind the city. The first few days were serene. Daniel woke up to the quiet of the forest, spent his days writing, sitting before the fire in the evening. The only sound were the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of birds. He even took long walks through the woods, the crunch of snow underfoot a smoothing rhythm. But as the days wore on, the tranquility began to wane, replaced by an unsettling feeling he could in quiet place. One evening, as he was returning from a walk, Daniel noticed something peculiar. The snow was disturbed around the cabin, tracks that seemed to be appear and disappear as if someone or something had been pacing around his home. He shrugged it off, attributing it to an animal. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered, a nagging presence that he couldn't shake. That night, the wind howled with an intensity that rattled the windows. As Daniel laid in the bed, he heard a faint scratching sound outside his window, like nails dragging against the wood. He pulled the cover over his head, convincing himself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the scratching persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Finally, he mustered the courage to get up and check. But when he looked outside, there was nothing there. The next day, Daniel decided to investigate the tracks more closely. He followed them deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser and the snow was untouched by any other prints. The tracks seemed to lead him toward a grove of ancient pines. At the center of the grove stood a tree unlike the others, its bark twisted and darkened as if scared by some unknown force. At its base, Daniel found a small wooden totem covered with carved primitive figures. He recognized it from the folklore he had read about the Wendigo, a spirit of insatiable hunger and malevolence. Unease settled in his stomach. He had heard of the Wendigo in tales and legends, an entity born of starvation and evil, said to drive man mad and consume their flesh. It was nothing more than a story to him, a relic of superstition, but the totem felt ominous, and the track that led to it only deepened his anxiety. That evening, as the sky turned a bruised shade of purple and the cold seeped into every corner of the cabin, Daniel tried to shake off his unease. He sat by the fire, reading an old folklore book, trying to distract himself. Yet the scratching sound from the night before have returned, this time accompanied by a low whispering. The voices were unintelligible, like a foreign language that scrapped against his sanity. His nerves were on the edge. Sleep came fitfully, and when he did manage to drift off, he was plagued by nightmares, visions of gaunt, skeletal figures with hollow eyes and mouths stretched into grotesque grains. He would wake up to the sound of his own heart pounding in his chest, the whispers still echoing in his ears. The following day, Daniel felt compelled to go back to the grove. The air was colder, the sky an oppressive grey. He approached the twisted tree with a growing sense of dread. This time he noticed something even more disturbing. The totem was gone. In its place, a crowd pile of sticks and bones, arranged in circles. The tracks around the grove had become more erratic, leading in all directions as if whatever had made them was circling in the area. Daniel's sense of dread intensified. He hurried back to his cabin, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more desperate, as if calling him, begging him to listen to those whispers. Desperation drove Daniel to search for answers. He delved into old journals and letters left by his ancestors, hoping to find something that could explain the horrors he was experiencing. One night, he found an old diary belonging to his great-grandfather. The entries detailed a series of unsettling events that had occurred in this cabin long before Daniel's time. Disappearances, strange noises, and sighting of shadowy figures in the woods. The final entry spoke of a dark presence that had been driving people mad, a hunger that could never be satisfied. As the days passed, the whispers became more coherent. They began to form words, hungry, and come closer. You can't escape. The presence outside seemed to grow bolder, scratching at the windows, shaking the walls. Daniel could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. The Wendigo was no mere legend. It was real, and it was hunting him. One night, unable to bear the terror, any longer. Daniel barricaded himself inside the cabin. He piled furniture against the door and the windows, hoping to keep the entity at the bay. As he sat in the dim lit light of the fireplace, the whispers turned into screams, filling the cabin with a cacophony of rage and hunger. The wind howled a ferocity that threatened to tear the cabin apart. In the dead of night, there was a loud crash. A window shattered, and the cold air rushed in. Daniel's heart raced as he heard the creature moving through the cabin, its presence palpable, even if it was unseen. He grabbed a flashlight and a hunting knife, preparing for the worst. The creature's breath was icy, and its presence seemed to close in around him. Daniel could see its shadows moving along the walls, a skeletal figure with eyes that glowed with an malevolent hunger. He fought to keep his composure, his grip on the knife, trembling as he prepared for the final confrontation. Suddenly, there was a silence. The whispers ceased, the howls faded, and the cold receded. Daniel, heart pounding, searched the cabin but found nothing. The Wendigo had vanished, leaving behind only the remains of its terror. Exhausted, he slumped to the floor, his mind reeling from the ordeal. The next morning, Daniel awoke to find the cabin eerily quiet. The snow outside had settled, the tracks around the cabin gone as if they had never been there. The totem in the groove was back in its place, untouched and unscathed. It was as though the nightmare had never happened. Daniel left the cabin soon as after, unable to stay any more longer. He returned to the city, but the experience had left an indelible mark on him. He could no longer write, could no longer sleep without the haunting memories of the Wendigo's whispers. The forest had claimed a part of him, and he knew he could never return to the place of isolation. Return to the place of isolation. Years later, the cabin was abandoned, its windows dark and its walls silent. The legend of the Wendigo continued to lurk in the whispers of the wind and the shadows of the trees. Those who ventured too close spoke of a lingering presence, a hunger that could never be satisfied, and somewhere in the deep woods the Wendigo waited, its whispers echoing through the dark, dense pines. I have been debating whether or not to share this story, but I think it's time. It's a terrifying experience that stuck with me for a while, and I hope it serves as a warning for those who might wander into places they shouldn't. A few months ago, I set out on a solo camping trip to a secluded forest area in Arizona. The place was recommended by a friend who knew I was an outdoors enthusiast. It was described as a pristine, untouched forest, perfect for peaceful getaways. I drove out early in the morning, winding along a narrow, unpaved road that snaked through the dense forest. The drive was beautiful, but desolated, with only the occasional deer crossing on the road and the thick canopy of leaves overhead blocking out the sun. By late afternoon, I reached the campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. I set up my tent and started a fire in few minutes, hoping to enjoy a tranquil evening away from the outside world. As night fell, the forest around me was swallowed by the shadows. The fire cast a warm glow, but the darkness beyond was almost impenetrable. As I sat by the fire, the stillness of the forest was occasionally broken by the sound of leaves rustling or the distant call of an animal. It was a peaceful night until the silence was disturbed by something strange, something I never thought I will occur. It started as a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the edge of the forest. I assumed it was some animal, perhaps a woodpecker or a squirrel, but the tapping was inconsistent and irregular. It was almost like the sound of something dragging across the ground, an unsettling pattern that didn't match any natural forest noise. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire and the comfort of the warm flames. But the tapping grew louder and louder by each second passing, more deliberate, and seemed to be coming closer. It was as if something was circling the perimeter of the clearing around my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and I walked toward the edge of the light. I shined the beam into the darkness, but all I could see was the dense blackness of the trees and the tangled underbrush. The tapping ceased abruptly, leaving the only oppressive silence of the night. I stood there, feeling a creeping unease, and then I heard something else, a soft, indistinct murmur that seemed to drift from the shadows, carried by the wind all around the forest. I took a few steps back, closer to the fire, trying to shake off the discomfort I'm feeling that moment. But the murmuring continued, growing fainter and then louder, as if someone was trying to speak to me from the darkness. The whispers became clearer, though the words were still unclear. It was as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with me in a language I couldn't understand. The sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder, echoing through the trees, though I couldn't see what was causing them, but it grew louder. Few minutes later, I heard a voice, a deep, broken whisper that was almost too quiet to hear. It said, "Come out, come closer." The voice was twisted and alien, as if it came from a place beyond the natural world. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I turned back to the tent, but the feeling of being watched persisted, as if unseen eyes were following me on my every move. The forest was still, but the air was charged with an unseen threat that I never felt before. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imaginations, but the sense of dread only grew more stronger. I sat by the fire, clutching a stick and staring into the darkness, waiting for the noise to stop. The murmuring and the tapping continued, a rhythmic and almost hypnotic pattern that played on my nerves. I could hear something moving just beyond the edge of the forest, its presence marked by subtle shifts in the shadows. I heard a sharp crack, a loud sudden noise that shattered the unease. I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight wildly around the campsite. The beam revealed nothing but the dark forest. As I stood there, froze in fear, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was tall and thin, with limbs that moved in an unnatural and jerky manner. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeleton frame. It had hollow, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light from the fire, and its presence was a void in the night. The figure stood still, watching me with an unsettling stillness. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of discordant voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My mind raced, trying to understand what I was seeing. I had heard stories about skinwalkers, but seeing one was a different kind of terror. This creature seemed to be a dark mirror of humanity, something twisted and creepy. The figure slowly raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed directly at me. The gesture was slow and deliberate, and it filled me with a primal fear that I couldn't ignore anymore. The murmuring grew louder, becoming a barrage of voices begging, cursing, and threatening me. I backed away from the fire, my legs moving on instincts as I stumbled toward my car. The figure followed me, moving silently but with a deliberate intent. I felt its gaze on me, a suffocating weight that pushed me faster through the darkness. After running through the forest, eventually I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Still, I could hear the figure moving closer than ever, the sound of its footsteps growing louder as I struggled to get inside of my car. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The growl that came from the forest was slow and menacing, a sound that promised violence. Nonetheless, I started the engine and sped away, the gravel road crunching beneath the tires as I fled from the forest. I drove back to the civilization, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened to me. What did I just witness? I could still hear the whispers in my ears and see the dark figure's eyes in my mind. The memory of that night is a constant reminder of the darkness that can dwell in the wilderness. I haven't returned to that forest, and I don't think I ever will. The forest holds a darkness that I can't ignore, and the shadows of that night continue to haunt me till this day. If you ever go camping in a forest, if you are solo, then be aware of your surroundings. About 2 weeks ago, I decided to take a drive up to the cabin I had rented for the weekend. The cabin was located in a deep remote forest in the mountains, far from the civilization. I had planned for a quiet, relaxing getaway, but things went horribly wrong from the very beginning of my trip. I left for the cabin late in the afternoon after I get off from my work, hoping to get there before the dark. Before the dark swallowed the forest. I was driving an old sedan that my father gave to me. It was a slow drive, and while it wasn't the most reliable car, I didn't think much of it until I took a turn off the main road and started down a narrow, winding dirt path that led to the cabin. As the night fell, the temperature dropped very quickly. The trees around me becoming dark silhouette against the starlight sky. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth and tangled branches that seemed to close in on the road. The road itself was rough and uneven, but I pressed on, eager to reach my destination. The weight of the day kept falling on me, pushing me into sleep, but I kept going. After some time, suddenly without any warning, I heard a loud, ominous clunk from under the car. I felt a jolt and the engine sputtered and died. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to restart the engine, but it was no use. The car was completely broke down in the middle of nowhere with no signals or cell tower. I sat there in the darkness, my breath fogging up the windows. The only light came from the dim beam of my headlight, which barely cut through the dense forest that surrounded me. The silence was suffocating nonetheless, broken only by the crackling of branches and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. I tried to stay calm. I pulled out my phone to call for roadside assistance, but there was no signal, just like before. I was completely cut off from the outside world, stuck in the road in the middle of the forest. I had no choice but to wait until the morning, hoping that I could get a signal or that someone might pass by that I can ask help for. The darkness around me growing more intense. I turned off the engine and sat in the darkness and shivering in the cold. The silence grew heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I could see nothing outside the car except the shadows and darkness. After a while, I started to hear something, a faint, dragging sound coming from the edge of the forest. It was subtle at first, like the rustling of leaves, moving of branches, but it grew louder as the time went on. My heart began to race, and I looked out through the windshield, but I couldn't see anything. The noises continued around me, accompanied by a low guttural growl that made me jump. It was a sound that seemed to come from the deep within the earth, primal and menacing. I wanted to get out the car and investigate, but the fear kept me freeze in my seat. I sat in my seat and looked around frantically. Then I saw it, emerging from the darkness at the edge of the forest was a figure that defined all the reason. It was tall and large, its limbs long and spindly, bending at unnatural angles. Its skin was sickly gray, stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes were wide, hollow pits that seemed to drink in the scanlight from the headlight. I looked more close. Its face looked like a skull, a deer skull, the Wendigo. I didn't know at the time, but I would later learn that this was the creature from the legends, an ancient spirit of hunger and winter, a being of unending greed and malevolence. It moved with a disturbing, jerky motion, dragging itself toward in my way that was both unnatural and horrifying at the same time to watch. Its mouth was gaping open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to gleam in the dark. It was as if the creature was starving, not just for food, but for something more profound. I could only watch in frozen terror as it approached the car. Its growl grew louder, more intense, a sound that seemed to echo the desolation and the hunger that this creature embodied. My breath quickened, and I tried to keep as still as I possible, hoping that if I didn't move, it wouldn't notice me. Through the windshield, I could see the Wendigo's long, bony fingers reaching out, dragging against the dirt and leaves on the ground. It moved closer, its eyes locked onto the car, as if it were seizing up its prey. The cold wind blew in through the cracked windows, carrying with it the stench of rot and decay. The creature seemed to circle the car, its movements slow and deliberate. It would occasionally stop and stare through the windows with those hollow eyes, as if searching for any signs of any movements inside the car. Every time it did, my heart would skip a beat. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to come closer. I reached into the back seat and grabbed a flashlight I had brought with me, hoping that if I could shine it at the Wendigo, it might scare it away. I turned on the flashlight and shone it through the windshield. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating Wendigo's gaunt face. The creature flinched at the light, recoiling slightly, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a shriek that pierced the night, a sound of pure, unrelenting hunger. I knew that I had to act fast. I grabbed my keys and made for the door, planning to run into the forest and trying to find some shelter or a way out. But as soon as I opened the door, the cold air hit me hard as a hammer, and I saw the Wendigo standing right in front of me. Its long claw reached out. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but the creature was relentless. It started scraping at the windows, its claws making a horrible screeching sound against the glass of the car. I could see its face pressed against the window, its hollow eyes staring right at me. Panic surged through me, and I began to shout for help, though I know no one could hear me. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it at the Wendigo, but it only seemed to make it more agitated. The creature let out another chilling scream, a sound that seemed to shake the very trees around us. I had no choice but to hide in the car. I crawled into the back seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the Wendigo moving around my car, dragging its claw along the sides. making the metal groan and creak. I closed my eyes and lay low as close as possible. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I don't know how long I was huddled there, but eventually the sounds outside began to fade. The Wendigo's growls grew more distant, and the scraping noises became less frequent. When the sounds finally stopped, I waited in the darkness for what felt like an eternity before I dared to look out. The creature was gone, leaving only its tracks in the snow and the mark of its claw on my car. I waited until the first light before I ventured outside. The forest was still and silent, the snow covered ground eerily precise. I could see the Wendigo's tracks leading back into the depth of the forest, but I had no intention of following them. I managed to call for a tow truck once I was back on the road, and I got out of there as fast as I could. After waiting in the clearing, a tow truck arrived shortly after my call. They drive me into the nearest town, where I able to fix my car, and I drove straight back to my home. I have been trying to put the experience behind me. I still have nightmares about that night, and the hollow eyes of that creature with the skull face still haunting me. I have been thinking about posting this for a while now, but every time I get close to doing it, I hesitate. I guess it's just that. Even now, I have hard time believing what happened. I have read about similar encounters, but nothing really prepared me for the terror I felt that night. I'm not usually one to get spooked by stories or mythical tales. I have always been more of a skeptic, but what I experienced was beyond anything I could have imagined. I hope sharing this helped me come to terms with it, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there has experienced something similar to mine. It all started about a year ago. I had taken a week off from work and decided to spend some time camping in the woods near my hometown. It's a pretty remote area with thick trees and barely any trails. It's the kind of place where you can be completely alone if you want to be. I like that anyway. It's peaceful and away from the constant hum of daily life. One day, I packed up my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to my usual spot. I set up a camp in a small clearing surrounded by a dense forest. As evening approached, I built a fire and settled with a book to read for the night, planning to enjoy a quiet night under the stars and the moon. Time passes by. Around midnight, I was dozing off by the fire when I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a sound I couldn't place, like a soft thud, followed by a heavy, dragging noise. At first, I thought it was just some animal or maybe the wind, but it was eerily consistent, like footsteps coming closer and closer. I stood up and scanned the darkness. The firelight barely reached beyond a few feet, and beyond that was just inky blackness. You could see nothing out there, even if someone hiding behind the trees. The dragging noises grew louder, and my gut told me it wasn't just a normal animal. The sound wasn't quite right. It was too deliberate and too heavy for some small animal. I grabbed a flashlight and shone into the woods, to the direction where the sound was coming from. But all I could see was the dense forest and shadows playing tricks on my eyes. The noises stopped abruptly, and for a few more seconds, there was just silence. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my machete just in case and ventured into the woods in the darkness that swallowed the entire forest. The woods was quiet now, but I could still hear the faint rustling noises, like something or someone moving just out of my sight. As I moved deeper, the rustling grew more pronounced. I stopped and listened carefully. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam, in the dim light, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the tree lines. It was too big to be a deer or even a bear, and the movement was too strange too. It was almost like it was moving on its two behind legs, but hunched over, making it look awkward and unnatural. I squinted my eyes, trying to get a better look in the darkness. That's when I saw it. Its eyes, they were glowing, reflecting the light of my flashlight. They were not like animal eyes. They were more like a pair of eerie, yellowish orbs staring right back at me. My blood ran cold through my entire body. I froze in terror, unsure of what to do. The creature's eyes seemed to follow me as I slowly backed away from the tree lines. Suddenly, it let out a low, guttural growl that made my skin peel off. I turned and ran back towards the camp, my heart racing in my chest, the sound of heavy footsteps pursuing me and getting closer with each step. When I reached the clearing, I fumbled with my flashlight and managed to shine it in the direction of the noises. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The creature was almost fully revealed in the moonlight now. It was enormous, standing on the two legs with a muscular build covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its head was like a wolf, but much larger, and its eyes, they were those same haunting orbs. The face was a grotesque blend of canine and human features, with a snort that seemed to curl into a wicked grin, looking at me. I grabbed my phone and tried to take a picture, but my hand was shaking too badly. In a panic, I reached for the fire poker, trying to look intimidating and make as much noise as possible. The creature paused at the edge of the flashlight, still watching me with those glowing eyes. It seemed to be assessing me, like it was calculating whether or not to approach. The face-off continued for a while, and sometimes after, suddenly the creature turned and ran back into the forest, its footsteps fading in the dark forest, and I can still hear its howl in a far distance. I stood there, frozen in fear and terror. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe half an hour. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. I stood by the fire, stoking it to keep it bright and hoping it would deter the creature. Every little sound made me jump, and every crackle of the fire seemed deafening. I didn't dare move from my spot, not even back to my tent or check my surroundings. As dawn approached, the noises and the creature's presence gradually faded. I waited until the first light of morning before I dared to leave the safety of the fire. When I finally did, I found evidence of its presence. Deep, heavy tracks in the ground around my camp, and broken branches where it had pushed through the underbrush. I can see its footprints in the mud. It was much larger any other animal I have ever seen. I packed up quickly as I could and left the woods, my mind racing with what I had seen. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I don't have plan to. I don't know what the creature was, but it was like anything I ever seen before. It wasn't a bear or a known animal. It was something far more sinister. I have read about similar encounters with a creature called the Dogman, or something similar, and it seems like what I saw fit the description. I don't know if it was the same creature or just something that happened to be similar like that, but I know that I have experienced something real and terrifying. Stay safe out there. Sometimes what we think we know about the woods might be just the tip of the iceberg. It's much darker than we thought. I have been debating whether or not to share this story, but I think it's time. It's a terrifying experience that stuck with me for a while, and I hope it serves as a warning for those who might wander into places they shouldn't. A few months ago, I set out on a solo camping trip to a secluded forest area in Arizona. The place was recommended by a friend who knew I was an outdoors enthusiast. It was described as a pristine, untouched forest, perfect for peaceful getaways. I drove out early in the morning, winding along a narrow, unpaved road that snaked through the dense forest. The drive was beautiful, but desolated, with only the occasional deer crossing on the road and the thick canopy of leaves overhead blocking out the sun. By late afternoon, I reached the campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. I set up my tent and started a fire in few minutes, hoping to enjoy a tranquil evening away from the outside world. As night fell, the forest around me was swallowed by the shadows. The fire cast a warm glow, but the darkness beyond was almost impenetrable. As I sat by the fire, the stillness of the forest was occasionally broken by the sound of leaves rustling or the distant call of an animal. It was a peaceful night until the silence was disturbed by something strange, something I never thought I will occur. It started as a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the edge of the forest. I assumed it was some animal, perhaps a woodpecker or a squirrel, but the tapping was inconsistent and irregular. It was almost like the sound of something dragging across the ground, an unsettling pattern that didn't match any natural forest noise. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire and the comfort of the warm flames. But the tapping grew louder and louder by each second passing, more deliberate, and seemed to be coming closer. It was as if something was circling the perimeter of the clearing around my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and I walked toward the edge of the light. I shined the beam into the darkness, but all I could see was the dense blackness of the trees and the tangled underbrush. The tapping ceased abruptly, leaving the only oppressive silence of the night. I stood there, feeling a creeping unease, and then I heard something else, a soft, indistinct murmur that seemed to drift from the shadows, carried by the wind all around the forest. I took a few steps back, closer to the fire, trying to shake off the discomfort I'm feeling that moment. But the murmuring continued, growing fainter and then louder, as if someone was trying to speak to me from the darkness. The whispers became clearer, though the words were still unclear. It was as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with me in a language I couldn't understand. The sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder, echoing through the trees, though I couldn't see what was causing them, but it grew louder. Few minutes later, I heard a voice, a deep, broken whisper that was almost too quiet to hear. It said, "Come out, come closer." The voice was twisted and alien, as if it came from a place beyond the natural world. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I turned back to the tent, but the feeling of being watched persisted, as if unseen eyes were following me on my every move. The forest was still, but the air was charged with an unseen threat that I never felt before. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imaginations, but the sense of dread only grew more stronger. I sat by the fire, clutching a stick and staring into the darkness, waiting for the noise to stop. The murmuring and the tapping continued, a rhythmic and almost hypnotic pattern that played on my nerves. I could hear something moving just beyond the edge of the forest, its presence marked by subtle shifts in the shadows. I heard a sharp crack, a loud sudden noise that shattered the unease. I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight wildly around the campsite. The beam revealed nothing but the dark forest. As I stood there, frozen in fear, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was tall and thin, with limbs that moved in an unnatural and jerky manner. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeleton frame. It had hollow, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light from the fire and its presence was a void in the night. The figure stood still, watching me with an unsettling stillness. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of discordant voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My mind raced, trying to understand what I was seeing. I had heard stories about skinwalkers, but seeing one was a different kind of terror. This creature seemed to be a dark mirror of humanity, something twisted and creepy. The figure slowly raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed directly at me. The gesture was slow and deliberate, and it filled me with a primal fear that I couldn't ignore anymore. The murmuring grew louder, becoming a barrage of voices begging, cursing, and threatening me. I backed away from the fire, my legs moving on instincts as I stumbled toward my car. The figure followed me, moving silently but with a deliberate intent. I felt its gaze on me, a suffocating weight that pushed me faster through the darkness. After running through the forest, eventually I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Still, I could hear the figure moving closer than ever, the sound of its footsteps growing louder as I struggled to get inside of my car. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The growl that came from the forest was low and menacing, a sound that promised violence. Nonetheless, I started the engine and sped away, the gravel road crunching beneath the tires as I fled from the forest. I drove back to the civilization, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened to me. What did I just witness? I could still hear the whispers in my ears and see the dark figure's eyes in my mind. The memory of that night is a constant reminder of the darkness that can dwell in the wilderness. I haven't returned to that forest, and I don't think I ever will. The forest holds a darkness that I can't ignore, and the shadows of that night continue to haunt me till this day. If you ever go camping in a forest, if you are solo, then be aware of your surroundings. It was supposed to be a routine hunt. For the last 15 years, Gerard had followed the same path through the dense woods of northern Arizona, guiding hunters through the unforgiving terrain and ensuring their safety. But this time, it was different. The season had been usually warm, and the elk seemed to have migrated early. Gerard had to venture deeper into the forest than usual. It was just him and one other hunter, a greenhorn named Kyle, who had recently joined his guide service. The day began like any other. The sun was barely breaking through the thick canopy of pine trees, casting elongated shadows across the forest floor. Kyle, young and eager, was full of questions about the local wildlife and Gerard's past experiences in the forest. Gerard answered with half-hearted enthusiasm, his mind already focused on the task ahead of them. As they set out, the forest felt unusually quiet. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves were absent that time. Gerard dismissed it as just another quirk of the season, but he noticed Kyle shifting nervously, glancing around as though he were being watched. They made their way through the narrow trail that Gerard has used countless times before. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower in the sky. The air grew more colder, and the woods became more denser. It was then that Gerard spotted something odd, a series of large and deep tracks in the mud before them. They were too large for an elk, too regular to be a bear. Ever seen track like this before? Kyle asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. Gerard shook his head. No, and I have been in these woods my whole time. I never seen something like this before. Let's keep moving. They followed the track for hours, growing more concerned as they saw no sign of elk anywhere near them. Only the strange footprints. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing tighter together as the light waned. Gerard was about to suggest heading back when they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing, there was an abandoned cabin, its windows boarded up and the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The sight was unsettling enough. Gerard had heard stories about old cabins in the deep woods, places where people went missing or even worse happened to them. Let's not go in there, Gerard said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. But Kyle was already moving towards the cabin, driven by an insatiable curiosity because of his young age and the lack of experience in the woods. Gerard had no choice but to follow him. As they both approached the cabin, the air grew more colder, and a strange smell, a mix of decay and something foul, permeated the space. They entered inside the cabin. The cabin was filled with old, rotting furniture and layers of dust beneath them. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Gerard scanned the room, noticing symbols that were visible on the walls of the cabin. They approached more closely to investigate what it was. When they got closer, it looked like a dark liquid splattered all around the wall. It looked like blood. A chill ran down his spine. He knew those symbols were not part of any traditional folklore he had heard in the area before. They were more sinister, more malevolent. Let's get out of here, Gerard urged, grabbing Kyle's arm. But Kyle, now visibly shaken, had noticed something else. Two figures standing silently outside the cabin, their features obscured by the dark. Who's there? Kyle called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. But no response came. The figures remained motionless, their presence eerie and unsettling. Gerard could feel his pulse quickening. He knew something was terribly wrong. He pulled Kyle towards the exit, but as they stepped outside, the figures had vanished. Maybe it's just a trick of the light, Kyle suggested, trying to sound brave and unnerving. Maybe, Gerard replied, but his voice was laced with uncertainty. They started making their way back. The forest now feeling claustrophobic and menacing. The strange tracks had disappeared, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to follow them. As the darkness fell, Gerard's flashlight beam picked up something that made his blood run cold. A figure watching them from the tree line, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Move," Gerard shouted, pushing Kyle to keep moving. The forest seemed to come alive, with whispers and rustling sound that grew louder with every step they took. The feeling of being watched intensified, and every shadow seemed to move and shift around them, creating the illusion of figures lurking just out of sight. They stumbled through the dark, desperately trying to find their way back. Gerard's instincts told him they were being herded, led deeper into the woods. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into the unnerving darkness. In the pitch black, Gerard heard Kyle's panicked breathing and the sound of something moving rapidly through the underbrush. He reached out, trying to guide them, but Kyle suddenly screamed, a blood-curdling scream that was abruptly cut off. Gerard froze, his heart pounding as he strained to hear any sign of Kyle. The woods were silent again, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. Gerard continued to move, hoping that he could find his way back to the safety. His instincts told him that whatever had taken Kyle was still following him, watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, Gerard stumbled into the clearing where they had found the cabin. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an eerie light over the scene. He found himself drawn back to the cabin, compelled to search for answers. Inside, the symbols on the wall seemed to have changed, their patterns shifting and moving as if alive. The foul odor was stronger, and the air felt heavy with an ancient malevolence. Gerard's flashlight beam flickered, revealing a dark figure lying in the corner of the room. Kyle, or what was left of him. His face was twisted in a look of sheer terror, his eyes wide open and unseeing. Gerard collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by grief and terror. The realization of what had just happened to Kyle and what was stalking him began to sink in. The stories he heard about skinwalkers, beings capable of taking on the appearance of others and preying on the living, were all too real for now to him. As Gerard left the cabin, the forest seemed to close in around him. The tracks, the figures, and the eerie silence were all signs that the skinwalker was still hunting him. He had to get out before he became their next victim. With every step, the forest seemed to closer. Gerard's flashlight died, and the oppressive darkness was suffocating. The whispers grew more louder, and the feeling of being watched was relentless. He pushed forward, guided only by instincts and sheer will, until he finally saw the faint light of the dawn breaking through the trees. When he finally emerged from the woods, Gerard was a broken man. The authorities searched for Kyle, but found no trace of him. Gerard's story was dismissed as a product of stress and imagination. But he knew the truth. He had seen the skinwalkers, and he had narrowly escaped from their clutches. The experience left him haunted. He no longer guided hunts, no longer ventured deeper into those woods. The stories he had once heard and dismissed were now his own reality, and he knew that the woods held a dark secret that best to be undisturbed. He had survived, but the memory of that night and the fear of what's still lurking in the shadows that never going to leave him. Hope you guys like this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to this channel. Enable the bell icon so you don't miss new uploads. And also check out other videos in this channel too. Like them and share them. And if you have any suggestions or any improvements I need to make in this channel, please post them in the comment section. Till next time, this is Malayali Wendigo. Bye.